Hello and welcome back to the channel. We are out in the flower field again this week, and in my opinion it's one of the most exciting days of the year on the flower farm. It's not the most glamorous day, if you can't tell by my outfit here, but we are actually going to start planting out some seedlings. I planted out a few sweet peas last weekend, and this weekend I'm going to be planting out other cool loving perennials and annuals, so things like yarrow, feverfew, lisianthus, and snapdragons. Now in the beds behind me, I've already done some bed prep. I went ahead and I topped every single bed off with about 1 or 2 inches of compost. I also applied some organic amendments that were recommended by my agronomist. Elemental sulfur being one of them. That helps with our pH out here on the flower farm and make sure the flowers can actually access the nutrients in the soil. And gypsum being the other, and that's a calcium supplement. That's what helps keep the flower stems really strong and prevents them from flopping over or being relatively weak in the vase. The next thing I'm going to walk you through is applying a thin layer of fertilizer. Then we're going to broad fork the beds, and I'll talk more about that when we get there. I'll lay out my drip irrigation, a little bit of landscape fabric, and finally we'll get to planting. So let's dive in.
Now that the beds have been fully prepped, I'm laying out the drip irrigation lines. You can see this bed is going to have 4 drip lines. They're perfectly spaced so that the irrigation is hitting the points where the roots will be for all of the flowers that will be planted out into this bed. I'm connecting each line to the main water line that actually connects to just a standard hose tap on my house. On the opposite end of the bed, all of those drip irrigation lines are capped off, and I'm simply securing them in place with some lawn staples so they don't move with heat and expansion throughout the hot summer months.
Now I just showed you the process of laying out the weed barrier fabric. I use weed barrier fabric on a lot of the beds here in the flower farm, but not all of them. There's certain flowers that can't tolerate the heat and the moisture that this fabric generates, and I have various perennials that grow in size every year, and I don't want them to be bound to the holes in the fabric either. There's a few reasons I use the weed barrier fabric on the beds that I do. The number one reason is it helps me a ton with spacing when I'm planting out. Different flowers require different spacing, so I have different templates for all of those varieties. This one, for example, the holes are spaced 6 inches apart, and I have other templates for 9-inch spacing and 12-inch spacing. Once I have the weed barrier fabric out, I can grab my plug trays and I can just drop a plug in every hole, and I know I'm maximizing the spacing for each bed. That is incredibly important on a flower farm my scale. I'm growing on about 1/4 of an acre, so I want to take advantage of every single inch. Now, the other thing this weed barrier fabric really helps with is keeping the weeds at bay. I am a one-woman show here on the flower farm, so weeding is something that can be very time-consuming. And when I use the weed barrier fabric, the weeds are only going to be popping up where the holes are burned into the fabric and nowhere else. So it cuts down substantially on my weeding throughout the season. The other thing that is important to keep in mind, I am using that drip irrigation that you saw me roll out. I like to have that underneath the fabric so that the water isn't beating off or dripping off of the fabric throughout the season. And I definitely wanted to amend the soil before laying this down. I won't really be able to amend the soil throughout the rest of this plant's growing cycle at least, until I need to flip the bed later in the season. Right now I'm going to show you how I would plant out a lisianthus tray. These are some of the only annual flowers on the flower farm that I order in plugs for. I start more than 95% of the annuals here from seed, but lisianthus would need to be started well before the Christmas holiday in my growing zone, and it is much more cost effective and time effective to order these in. These guys arrived a little earlier in the week, and they've spent the week getting hardened off and adjusted to my climate. Now we're going to get to planting them. I use a landscape staple to pull the plugs out of the tray, and I start by just pulling them out and dropping them into one of those holes burned in the landscape fabric. I do the entire row just like that first before I come back to the start and actually get to planting. Once all of the plugs have been laid in the holes, I come back with my Hori Hori tool. You could also just use an old butter knife, and I use this to pull back the soil and plug in each plant. Now I came back a couple days later and I started the process of laying out the netting. With cut flower production, it's incredibly important to net certain flowers. This encourages long, tall stems and prevents them from getting damaged in high winds. Here I'm putting in some fiberglass rods, and I will eventually put some metal hoops over these that the netting will be hung on.